Keep your camera clean. Of course, it's very important to keep your camera clean, but today we're not talking about that. We are talking about one of the biggest and most common things that I see new photographers struggling with. That is the ability to take sharp photographs. We've all been in this situation where we were in an incredible location, we've been lucky, the light was perfect, we got a good composition, we come back, we download our photos, knowing that we've got some incredible images, but as soon as we open that in our bigger monitor in the computer, we realize that we only have a very soft and blurry version of what in our head was a perfect picture. We always start blaming the camera, the lens, we want to get some better gear and the lens is not sharp enough. It's of course easier to blame the camera or the lens for this problem, but it's usually something that we are doing wrong or something that we are not doing at all and we are supposed to, that leads to these very soft images. So today we are gonna talk about the most common mistakes that are leading to soft images and how to fix them. Now, the first and most common reason of soft images is that you're probably using a shutter speed that is too slow. For handheld shooting, a good rule of thumb is the 1 over the focal length equals the shutter speed that we should use. In fact, the longer the lens, the more amplification it will apply to any camera movement or micro shake that you might apply to the camera body. So applying this rule means if you're shooting on a 24mm lens, you should use a shutter speed that is at least 1/50th of a second. While if you use something longer, 200mm for example, you should use at least 1/400th of a second and so on. If I use my big 600mm here, I should use at least 1/1200th of a second. This will give you a good starting point, but then there are other lines of defense, of course. If you have IBIS on your camera or your lens has optical stabilization, turn these features on and this will allow you to go at a slightly lower shutter speed. You can also use other tricks to get sharp images at slower shutter speeds, like holding your camera with your elbows very close to your body, or I can put my camera on my shoulder and this creates a very stable platform for the camera. Something else I can do is to place the camera on a surface somewhere, even if it's just a piece of rock around in the field. It's still much more stable if I'm holding it there rather than just holding it in my hands around. Of course, when we are going to use very slow shutter speeds, let's say less than 1/20th of a second, I would always want to be on a tripod. I can still try to place my camera somewhere and hold it there and try to be steady, but the ideal way to deal with that is just using a tripod. Another shutter speed related problem happens when we are dealing with moving subjects. In this case, we want to have a shutter speed that is fast enough to freeze the movement of the subject, so the faster the subject, the faster the shutter speed that we need. I've been using shutter speeds of up to 1/4000th of a second to freeze the movements of some birds, or if we have a very slow moving animal, we can go even very slow and still get a very sharp image. Another reason that leads you to have these soft photos is using too high ISO. You're probably already familiar with the concept of ISO, that is basically a gain that we apply to whatever comes out of the sensor. This allows us to change the exposure without actually changing the light that is recorded by the sensor, right? If we change the aperture to something bigger or smaller, we are changing how much light is going through the lens and hitting the sensor. If we are changing the shutter speed to something slower or something faster, we are changing how much light is going through and hitting the sensor. Instead, if we are changing the ISO, we are not affecting at all the light that is hitting the sensor. We are only applying some gain to the signal, okay? So where is the problem? The problem is that in this signal that is coming out of the sensor, we have both the light recorded and the noise. And this might be a bit counterintuitive, but the amount of noise is actually the same when we shoot at ISO 100 or ISO 25,000. We have the same amount of noise. The difference is not in the noise, it's actually in the light level. We have our correct exposure, that is here, and we have our noise floor. And when we shoot at ISO 100, the levels are like so. Very low noise and a correct amount of light hitting the sensor. Now what happens when we shoot at ISO 25,000? If the light is constant and we increase the ISO, what we have to do? We have to get smaller aperture or a faster shutter speed. So we decrease the light hitting the sensor and then we apply again, and so we multiply everything. And what happens? We raise the level of both the noise and the light. How is this affecting the sharpness of the photo? Well, having all of this noise, super high level of noise in the image is deteriorating all of the signal that we have. Now, we are not talking about ISO 800 or 1600, but we have to be mindful that when we go to super high ISO like 25,000, 50,000, this range, we can do it if that's the only option because it's very dark, but we should expect the images not to be super sharp. Another issue might be that you are using the wrong aperture on your lens. Lenses tend to perform the best around 1 to 2 stops above the maximum aperture, right? This means that you get the best quality from your lens at f4 if the lens is f2.8, f5.6 if the lens is f4, and so on. Now, this is not super noticeable if you're using top quality professional lenses, but if you're shooting on a kit lens or something very cheap, this will make a big difference, because in these cheaper lenses there is a very wide gap of performance between the widest aperture and the optimal aperture. Also, lens performance starts to decrease at around f16, f18, so you would not want to shoot at f22 or above that. The optimal is always around f8 to f11. That's usually where you get the most out of your lens. You should try and take some tests and do some comparison because all lenses are different, but in that range is where you get the best of what you have. One of the best solutions to get sharper images is to use a tripod, but this has to be done the right way. The most common problem here happens when we have strong wind that can very easily introduce some shaking in the camera, even on a tripod. To prevent this, we want to take away everything that we can from the camera so that it has a smaller surface for the wind to have a grip on. One of the worst things to have here is the camera strap, because it provides like a flag attached to the camera that is shaking around in the wind, and even though we can not notice it, it's introducing some shaking in the camera. I suggest using some removable camera straps like these ones from Peak Design. You can easily remove it and put it back. So I can do this very quickly. So whenever I'm putting my camera on the tripod, I remove the camera strap, and then when I need it, I will put it back on. Another thing you could do when dealing with wind is removing the lens hood. Especially with bigger lenses, the lens hood catches a lot of wind. If it's really super windy, the last solution is to find a place that is protected from the wind. For example, you can park your car upwind from your camera so that the wind is hitting the car and not the camera. Also, when using tripod, we should remember that we are actually introducing camera shake the moment we are pressing the shutter button. Doesn't matter how soft we try to do that, we are touching the camera, and so we are introducing a little bit of shake. Every camera on the market has a shutter delay function, so we can just change our shooting mode in shutter delay. I usually use 2 seconds, I think it's more than enough for that. One last reason why you are not getting sharp photos might be a focus problem. Once again, we tend to blame the autofocus a lot, but Very often the problem is that we are using an incorrect setting for a given situation. Let's take the case of a landscape, nothing is moving in the frame, and we have our autofocus set on AFC, the continuous autofocus mode, what for Canon is servo autofocus. Well, in this case, the camera is looking for a subject to track, is looking for movement, so it might happen that the autofocus sometimes starts going back and forth and it might end in a very inaccurate focus. In this situation, it's always best to use the AFS. We can manually select the point where we want the focus to be and it will be very accurate. On the opposite side, if we are dealing with a fast moving subject, we want the autofocus to be on servo mode or AFC and to be optimized to follow and keep a fast moving object in focus. Remember that sharpness is not everything in a photo. It's important, but it's not everything. So remember that having an interesting subject in front of your lens, being able to create a good composition and understanding the light, all of these things are as important, if not more, than the ability to get a sharp photo. See you next week.